On December 7th, 1941, 6 midget submarines and over 300 aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, which was not yet a state. The date would be remembered as the Day of Infamy, as it was referred to by then U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his speech given the following day. It would also be granted the title that I just made up of contender for pre-9/11 days given 9/11 style humor. What most people leave out about this day, however, is that Pearl Harbor was not the only place that was attacked. The Japanese struck a number of vital American and British colonial holdings and military bases throughout the Pacific Ocean, as well as Southeast Asia. Today's video will be discussing all of these other attacks that are more times than not overshadowed by the events in Hawaii. I'm going to try to go through them in as close to chronological order as I can, barring Pearl Harbor itself, going from the first attack of the day to the last attack of the day. And going off of my normal style of videos, I'm not giving every individual piece of information that I can find, but more so just, I guess, the highlights, if you can really call it that. Mainly because of my thing that I said previously of I want to give the viewer the ability to do some more research in their own time, and also because I don't have the time to produce multi-hour long videos when I'm just doing all of the solo. I'm just a dude with a computer, a history addiction, and way too much free time. Also, for a prop, I was going to use the USS Arizona, like, battleship model that my late grandfather built, I think like a decade ago. However, I'm not, however, it is just after 10 p.m., and there's no way in hell I'm running out into the dark ass garage that most likely has spiders and shit in it. So I grabbed this Japanese Haori that I have. I'd like to emphasize, because I know at least one person's gonna assume this. Just because I have this does not mean that I'm siding with the Japanese in any of these. Hell, so as compensation for me not running out into the dark ass garage to grab this big ass boat model. You guys, compensation, this Lego Sherman that I made, which is gray instead of green for some reason. All that out of the way, let's get started. The first attack of the day came at around 7:45 a.m. Hawaii time, approximately 10 minutes before the bombs fell at Oahu. The target was the mainland portion of British Malaya, which is modern day Malaysia, which is part of modern-day Malaysia and Singapore. Like, bit of background context. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, British intelligence were notified of a large buildup of Japanese forces in Indochina, a former French colony passed over to the Japanese by the Vichy regime. As a result, mainland Malaya was fortified, as it was assumed that the Japanese were going to move through then-neutral Thailand and strike Malaya through the Kra Isthmus. The British also drew up plans for a possible invasion into Thailand itself before the Japanese attack began in order to secure the isthmus and the coastline, codenamed Operation Matador. This plan, however, was dropped, as the request for additional forces by Major General Sir William Dobby was denied. There are also political reasons involved in canceling the plan, since Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the general officer commanding Malaya, in a meeting with Malaya Governor Sir Shenton Thomas, spoke against the operation. In the early morning, around 1:45 a.m. local time, on December 8th, side note, many of these places were a day ahead due to time zones, when soldiers of the Japanese 25th Army, led by Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, landed at Kotobaru, on the northeastern coast of mainland Malaya. Japanese troops landed farther north into Thailand around 15 minutes later and moved southwest, opening a second front on the peninsula. Initially met with brutal resistance by British and Indian forces, the IJA won key engagements, eventually forcing the majority of the defenders to surrender. Indian forces launched Operation Krocho, however you pronounce that, a replacement to Matador, and moved to intercept the Japanese soldiers coming from Thailand. But they were quickly defeated and were forced to flee back across the border. Royal Navy Task Force Z was sent into the area shortly before the conflict began. It consisted of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, which some of you may recognize as the ship that sailed with the HMS Hood when it was sunk by the German battleship KMS Bismarck. The battlecruiser HMS Repulse was also with the Prince of Wales in Force Z, as well as a number of smaller destroyers. After being shattered by Japanese planes and even a submarine, Force Z was attacked by 88 Mitsubishi G3M Nell and G4M Betty bombers on the morning of December 10th. Both capital ships were sunk in the battle, being the first two ships of the type to be sunk by aircraft alone while in open waters. As far as aerial combat goes, there were very few Allied aircraft in the region at the time of the attack, with only one fighter squadron, the Australian number 21. As a result, when Japanese bombers attacked numerous military installations and key supply depots, including the colonial capital in Singapore, at around 4 a.m., the RAF could do next to nothing. By New Year's Day of 1942, approximately half of the Malay Peninsula had been occupied, and Thailand had formally entered the war as a Japanese ally, and the last forces of the British Commonwealth would evacuate mainland Malaya on January 31st. As mentioned previously, the IJA used Thailand's Kra Isthmus to land troops to attack Malaya. However, the peninsula was not the only Thai location hit by Japanese forces. The Japanese 5th Division was sent south into Malaya at the time of its invasion. But there was more to come. At approximately 2 a.m. local time, or around 9 a.m. Hawaii time, meaning that Pearl Harbor was actively under attack and had been for about an hour at this point, the IJA landed at numerous spots along the Kra Isthmus, as well as just south of the Thai capital, Bangkok. There was also a small ground invasion from southern Indochina. The invasion lasted around 5 hours before Prime Minister Plek Phibunsongkhram signed a ceasefire with the Japanese until a proper peace deal could be worked out. Thai government was issued an ultimatum from Tokyo around 11 p.m. earlier that night, demanding that the IJA be allowed to use Thailand as a landing ground for the Malayan front. Given only 2 hours to reply, Bangkok kept silent, partially due to Prime Minister Phibun being completely unaware that the ultimatum existed until daybreak, and, in the meantime, his own location was unknown. After the ceasefire, Bangkok and Tokyo began working out a long-term peace deal between the two countries, but it pretty much turned to Thailand becoming an unofficial Japanese client state. Thailand would allow Japanese forces to use their supply lines, ports, and air bases to aid the IJA in Malaya, as well as use the Thai border with Burma to begin the Burmese campaign on December 14th, during which Thailand was required to commit a number of their own troops to each front. They would also formally join the Japanese, signing an alliance with Tokyo on December 21st and officially declaring war on the US and UK in January. In return, Japan relinquished some Indo-Chinese and Burmese territories of Thailand that it formerly held until a series of treaties with the UK and France in the late 19th to the early 20th century were signed, handing over these lands to the European power. The next target on the Japanese hit list that day was the Malayan colonial capital of Singapore, which, yes, even though I mentioned Singapore briefly in the Malayan segment, Singapore in today is considered to be its own separate assault, its own separate target, separate from the rest of mainland Malaya. Japan saw the occupation of Malaya as a prerequisite to obtaining the Gibraltar of the East, as an amphibious assault from the Straits of Malacca and or the South China Sea would be too risky. As such, the city itself did not become a victim of Japanese invasion until February of 1942. However, the city did get hit with a number of bombing raids leading up to that point, with the first major one taking place around 4:30 a.m. local time. And for context, the Pearl Harbor attack would have concluded approximately a half hour prior to this. In the bombing, a total of 17 Japanese G-3M Nell bombers struck key points on the island of Singapore itself, as well as the immediate areas around it, striking multiple British airfields and the primary financial hub of the city in Raffles Place. While the attack itself did not do an incredibly large level of damage, it did take out a number of British aircraft and killed or injured well over 800 people, primarily Indian troops stationed in the airfield. This bombing raid was initially supposed to take place with 32 Japanese aircraft, but bad weather conditions in the area forced one of the bomber groups to disengage. As for the remaining 17 aircraft that did manage to get their bombs off, none of them got shot down, despite returning fire from both ground-based AA in the city itself, as well as AA fire from the Prince of Wales and Repulse, since at the time Force Z was stationed in port at the time of this bombing. The bombers were actually picked up on British radar approximately an hour before the attack took place. However, a request to send British fighters up to go intercept the bombers was rejected because, with it being around 3 in the morning at the time, there was too much fear that the British AA fire would end up shooting down its own aircraft. That, as well as the aircraft that were in the area, which at this point were only 3 Brewster 2FA Buffaloes supplied to Britain by the US during a Lend-Lease, were decided to be better for day combat as opposed to night missions. While it's definitely not a guarantee that this would be the case, because I highly doubt it would, had those 3 British fighters been approved to intercept the Japanese force, it's possible that they could have shot down some of the enemy aircraft, weakening the first bombing of Singapore, if not just having them be repelled entirely. However, given that there was only 3 fighters versus 17 bombers, I highly doubt that they would have been able to fully push them off. In the weeks leading up to the February 8th ground invasion and subsequent occupation of Singapore, there would be at least 3 more major bombing raids in the city, twice in mid to late December and once in mid-January. In case you couldn't tell this far in, Britain had quite a few colonial possessions in Asia. These range from tiny islands and archipelagos that didn't have an incredible amount of significance in the grand scheme of things, to huge swaths of land spanning thousands of Minecraft chunks. Take the specimen For example, that is Australia, the place that God tests his rough drafts. One of the smaller yet most vital areas of London's Asian holdings was the crown colony of Hong Kong along the South China Sea. Japan saw the small chunk of land as vital to the trade routes between China, who the Japanese had been fighting the Second Sino-Japanese War against since July of 1937, and the West. So by occupying it, the Chinese supply lines in the area would be strangled. It was also seen as a good defensive port that the Navy could use to extend its reach into Oceania. Beginning at 6 a.m. local time, with the crossing of 3 Japanese battalions over the Shamchun River in occupied China, the ground combat was initially fairly quiet, with only sporadic gunfire here and there. Proper fighting began around 3 p.m., when the 214th Punjab Regiment engaged the IJA at Laffin's Plain. But after a few hours and some significant victories against the invaders, the Commonwealth forces had to fall back to a more defensible position. By the end of the day, all Allied forces were ordered to the line of pre-made defenses in northern Hong Kong, known as the Gin Drinkers Line. In terms of Allied air and naval power, the majority of military and civilian aircraft were bombed and destroyed around 8 a.m. at Kai Tak Airport. The Royal Navy in the area was also incredibly underpowered for the assault. Consisting of some old World War I era destroyers, mine layers, and gunboats, the chance of any significant British naval action was slim to none, to say the least. The Battle of Hong Kong would continue until Christmas Day, when the British would formally surrender to Japanese forces. It would remain under Japanese occupation until the end of the war, notably being the shooting location of the 1942 Japanese propaganda film, I'm gonna butcher this, Hong Kong Koryaku, Ekoku Kuzuru no Hi, or The Battle of Hong Kong. The film is unfortunately considered lost media today, presumably being destroyed in one of the many Allied bombings of Japan, or the materials used in the stills being turned into wartime equipment. One of the most strategic positions in the Southeast Pacific that the Japanese were determined to acquire as soon as possible in the war was the American territory of Guam. Under U.S. control since the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, Guam was not seen as majorly advantageous by Washington outside of being sort of a checkpoint for a telegraph cable between the Philippines and mainland US, as well as a layover spot for air travel. Months prior to the attack, those not stationed on the island were evacuated for safety in the event that an assault on the island did take place. Just before 8:30 a.m. local time, Japanese bombers struck the oil silos, shipyard, radio station, and a hotel. On the first day, there were relatively few casualties, with only one American being killed on board the minesweeper USS Penguin and a few others being injured. On the Japanese side, only a single aircraft had been shot down by AA fire from the Penguin, the reaction of which brought upon the ship being attacked and scuttled in order to keep it out of Japanese hands if the islands were to fall. Bombing runs by the Japanese resumed the next day, and concluded on the 10th when around 400 Japanese soldiers landed on Guam, eventually forcing the American troops to surrender after a short series of combat. Another few thousand Japanese troops landed shortly after. Guam would remain under Japanese occupation until the Americans landed on and reclaimed the island in 1944 during the Pacific Island hopping campaign. Another Pacific island being used as an American naval base that was struck by the Japanese was Wake Island. Beginning in January of 1941, the U.S. government constructed a series of military installations on Wake Island, and the first groups of soldiers being stationed on the island arrived in mid-August. By the time of the war, Wake was used as a naval yard, supply depot, military and civilian airfields, among others. Shortly after receiving confirmation of the Pearl Harbor attack, the island was bombed by multiple bomber squadrons around 12 p.m. local time, quickly decimating the grounded American aircraft, disabling most of them. The few American planes that did get airborne were unable to shoot down any of the Japanese bombers until a separate wave of attacks the next day. On the first day of the Battle of Wake Island, approximately 40 military and civilian personnel were killed and dozens more were injured. A Japanese amphibious invasion took place days later, but it got repelled. The island eventually fell to the Japanese on December 23rd after a second ground invasion took place. Moving back closer to Asia, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was one of, if not the most necessary locations in the Japanese line of sight in the months leading up to December 1941. Due to its position between the Japanese home islands and the European colonies in Oceania, primarily the Dutch East Indies, it was absolutely vital that Tokyo bring the archipelago into its sphere of influence. The vast resources of the Philippines were also vital to the Japanese war effort. The American forces in the Philippines were on high alert after learning of Pearl Harbor, with plans of American bombings of the Japanese-held island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, being drawn up and set for that evening along with the following day. Before the operation was set in motion, however, Japanese forces began bombing Clark Field and Iba Field just before 12:30 p.m. local time. Due to radar pings an hour previous, there were a number of American fighters patrolling the skies prior to the attack, while the bombs were set up and prepared for the Formosa bombings. However, they had landed after running short on fuel. A number of other squadrons took their places as the Japanese force arrived, many of which, however, did not get the chance to get off the ground before being destroyed while taxiing. The attack lasted for approximately 1 hour, with most of the aircraft in both fields being damaged or destroyed, and the Iba airfield being virtually wiped off the map. During the rise of the airfields, the IJA also landed on Batan Island, a small landmass around 120 miles north of the biggest island in the Philippines, Luzon, with zero American resistance. Landings on Luzon itself took place a couple days later. Over the next few months, the campaign in the Philippines was a crushing defeat for the Americans. Not only did it allow the Japanese much easier access into the Dutch East Indies and the island regions of British Malaya in northwestern Borneo, it also set in motion the infamous Bataan Death March in April 1942, shortly after the country fell. The final target of the Japanese on December 7th or 8th, 1941, depending on where you are in the world, was the small atoll of Midway. This is not the Battle of Midway, which took place in June of 1942. One little side note that a good amount of people may not know. Midway is considered to be a part of the Hawaiian archipelago, the only part of the archipelago that is not considered part of the state of Hawaii. This attack was the last one of the day, taking place after nightfall at 9:30 p.m. local time. Two Japanese destroyers, the IJN Ushio and the IJN Sazanami, bombarded the atoll with the intent to weaken its defenses for a future invasion and occupation of it, culminating in the 1942 Battle of Midway, which was a colossal failure for Tokyo. Casualties were minimal, with only 4 American deaths during the bombardment. There you have it. The targets on December 7th, 1941, that were not the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. As per usual, anything that you, the viewer, may happen to notice that is incorrect to a degree, you are more than welcome to help me out and fact check it in the comment section. Be sure to take a look at my Discord server and Twitch channel, both of which are not incredibly active currently. However, I'm hoping to change that in the near future. Also, go subscribe to the Nightmarecast channel for the rare instance that it gets resuscitated every few months. Also, I don't know shit about YouTube etiquette in this aspect, but I will add this anyway. On top of the ordinary request that viewers share this video with their friends, family, and whoever else, I also kindly ask that you share this video with the other history YouTubers that you may or may not know. Not only would it be more publicity for myself and my goofy-ass videos, I would also like to be able to use any constructive criticism that they may or may not be willing to give me on the off chance that someone were to watch this, that I could use as, I guess, guidance for future videos. It would also be able to lead some of my currently pretty much microscopic audience towards them, giving them a small little boost in the process. I was going to do the outro of this video in Japanese, but that seemed to me to be in somewhat bad taste, as if my overall sense of humor is not in bad taste, and I don't know the accuracy of Google Translate for the other East Asian or Oceanic languages that were notable for some of the locations of these. So, as gailga it is. Kage Shannon Dom, Agus Korav Mahagav, as Uchto Quid Ama.